They had changed the simulator. He could still control the perspective and the degree of detail, but there were no ship's controls anymore. Instead, it was a new panel of levers and a small headset with earphones and a small microphone. The technician who was waiting there quickly explained how to wear the headset. But how do I control the ships? Asked Ender. Mazer explained. He wasn't going to control the ships anymore. You've reached the next phase of your training. You've experience in every level of strategy, but now it's time for you to concentrate on commanding an entire fleet. As you worked with toon leaders in battle school, so now you will work with squadron leaders. You have been assigned 36 such leaders to train. You must teach them intelligence, tactics. You must learn their strengths and limitations. You must make them into a whole. When will they come here? They're already in place in their own simulators. You will speak to them through the headset. The new levers on your control panel enable you to see from the perspective of any of your squadron leaders. This more closely duplicates the conditions you might encounter in the real battle, where you will know only what your ships can see. How can I work with squadron leaders I never see? And why would you need to see them? To know who they are, how they think. You'll learn who they are and how they think from the way they work with the simulator. But even so, I think you won't be concerned. They're listening to you right now. Put on the headset so you can hear them. Ender put on the headset. Salam, said a whisper in his ears. Alay, said Ender. And me, the dwarf. Bean. And Petra, and Dink, Crazy Tom, Shen, Hot Soup, Fly Molo, Karn Karbi, all the best students Ender had fought with or fought against, every one that Ender had trusted in battle school. I didn't know you were here, he said. I didn't know you were coming. They've been flogging us through a simulator for 3 months now, said Dink. You'll find that I'm by far the best tactician, said Petra. Dink tries, but he has a mind of a child. So they began working together, each squadron leader commanding individual pilots and Ender commanding the squadron leaders. They learned many ways of working together as the simulator forced them to try different situations. Sometimes the simulator gave them a larger fleet to work with. Ender set them up in 3 or 4 toons that consisted of 3 or 4 squadrons each. Sometimes the simulator gave them a single starship with its 12 fighters, and he chose 3 squadron leaders with 4 fighters each. It was pleasure. It was play. The computer-controlled enemy was none too bright, and they always won, despite their mistakes, their miscommunications. But in the 3 weeks they practiced together, Ender came to know them very well. Dink, who deftly carried out instructions but was slow to improvise. Bean, who couldn't control large groups of ships effectively but could use a few like a scalpel, reacting beautifully to anything the computer threw at him. Alay, who was almost as good a strategist as Ender, and could be entrusted to do well with half a fleet and only vague instructions. The better Ender knew them, the faster he could deploy them, the better he could use them. The simulator would display the situation on the screen. In that moment, Ender learned from the first time that his own fleet would consist of, and how the enemy fleet was deployed. It took him only a few minutes now to call the squadron leaders that he needed, assign them to certain ships or groups of ships, and give them their assignments. Then, as the battle progressed, he would skip from one leader's point of view to another, making suggestions and occasionally giving orders as the need arose. Since the others could see only their own battle perspective, he would sometimes give them orders that made no sense to them, but they too learned to trust Ender. If he told them to withdraw, they withdrew, knowing that either they were in an exposed position or their withdrawal might entice the enemy into a weakened posture. They also knew that Ender trusted them to do as they judged best when he gave them no orders. If their style of fighting were not right for the situation they were placed in, Ender would not have chosen them for that assignment. The trust was complete. The working of the fleet quick and responsive, and at the end of 3 weeks, Mazer showed him a replay of their most recent battle, only this time from the enemy's point of view. This is what he saw as you attacked. What does it remind you of? The quickness of response, for instance. We look like a bugger fleet. You match them, Ender. You're as fast as they are, and here, look at this. Ender watched as all his squadrons moved at once, each responding to its own situation, all guided by Ender's overall command, but daring, improvising, feinting, attacking like an independence no bugger ship had ever shown. The bugger hive is very good, but it can only concentrate on a few things at once. All your squadrons can concentrate keen intelligence on what they're doing. And what they've been assigned to do is also guided by a clever mind. So you see that you do have some advantages. Superior, though not irresistible, weaponry, comparable speed, and greater available intelligence. These are your advantages. Your disadvantage is that you will always, always be outnumbered. And after each battle, your enemy will learn more about you, how to fight you, and those changes will be put into effect instantly. Ender waited for his conclusion. So, Ender, we will now begin your education. We have programmed the computer to simulate the kinds of situations we might expect in encounters with the enemy. We are using the movement patterns we saw in the second invasion. But instead of mindlessly following these same patterns, I'll be controlling the enemy simulation. At first, you'll see easy situations that you're expected to win handily. Learn from them, because I will always be there, one step ahead of you. Programming more difficult and advanced patterns into the computer so that your next battle is more difficult, so that you are pushed to the limit of your abilities. And beyond, the time is short. You must learn as quickly as you can. When I give myself to starship travel, just so I could still be alive when you appeared, my wife and children all died. And my grandchildren were my own age when I came back. I had nothing to say to them. I was cut off from all the people that I loved, everything I knew, living in this alien catacomb and forced to do nothing of importance but teach student after student, each one so hopeful, each one ultimately a weakling, a failure. I teach, but no one learns. You too have great promise, like so many students before you. But the seeds of failure may be in you too. It's my job to find them, to destroy them if you can. And believe me, Ender, if you can be destroyed, I can do it. So I'm not the first. No, of course you're not. But you're the last. If you don't learn, there'll be no time to find someone else. So I have hope for you, if only because you are the only one left to hope for. What about the others, my squadron leaders? Which of them is fit to take your place? Allay. Be honest. Ender had no answer then. I'm not a happy man, Ender. Humanity does not ask us to be happy. It merely asks us to be brilliant on its behalf. Survival first, then happiness as we can manage it. So, Ender, I hope you do not bore me during your training with complaints that you're not having fun. Take that pleasure you can in the interstices of your work, but your work is first. Learning is first. Winning is everything, because without it, there is nothing. When you can give me back my dead wife, Ender, then you can complain to me about what this education costs you. I wasn't trying to get out of anything. But you will, Ender, because I'm going to grind you down to dust. If I can. I'm going to hit you with everything I can imagine, and I'll have no mercy, because when you face the buggers, they will think of things I can't imagine, and compassion for human beings is impossible for them. You can't grind me down, Mazer. Oh, can't I? Because I'm stronger than you. Mazer smiled. We'll see about that, Ender. Mazer wakened him before morning. The clock said 0340, and Ender felt groggy as he padded along the corridor behind Mazer. Early to bed and early to rise, Mazer intoned, makes a man stupid and blind in the eyes. He had been dreaming that buggers were vivisecting him. Only instead of cutting open his body, they were cutting up his memories and displaying them like holographs and trying to make sense of them. It was a very odd dream, and Ender couldn't easily shake loose of it, even as he walked through the tunnels to the simulator room. The buggers tormented him in his sleep, and Mazer wouldn't leave him alone when he was awake. Between the two of them, he had no rest. Ender forced himself awake. Apparently Mazer meant it when he said he meant to break Ender down, and forcing him to play when tired and sleepy was just the sort of cheap and easy trick Ender should have expected. Well, today, it wouldn't work. He got to the simulator and found his squadron leaders already on the wire waiting for him. There was no enemy yet, so he divided them into 2 armies and began a mock battle, commanding both sides so he could control the test that each of his leaders was going through. They began slowly, but soon were vigorous and alert. Then the simulator field went blank, the ships disappeared, and everything changed at once. At the near edge of the simulator field, they could see the shapes, drawn in holographic light, of 3 starships from the human fleet. Each would have 12 fighters. The enemy, obviously aware of the human presence, had formed a globe with a single ship at the center. Ender was not fooled. It would not be a queen ship. The buggers outnumbered Ender's fighter forces by 2 to 1. But they were also grouped much closer together than they should have been. Dr. Device would be able to do much more damage than the enemy expected. Ender selected 1 starship, made it blink in the simulator field, and spoke into the microphone. Alay, this is yours. Assign Petra and Vlad to the fighters as you wish. He assigned the other 2 starships with their fighter forces, except for 1 fighter from each starship that he reserved for Bean. Slip the wall and get below them, Bean. Unless they start chasing you, then run back to the reserves for safety. Otherwise, get in a place where I can call on you for quick results. Alay, form your force into a compact assault at one point in their globe. Don't fire until I tell you. This is maneuver only. This one's easy, Ender. Alay said. It's easy, so why not be careful? I'd like to do this without the loss of a single ship. Ender grouped his reserves into 2 forces that shadowed Alay at a distance. Bean was already off the simulator, though Ender occasionally flipped to Bean's point of view to keep track of where he was. It was Alay, however, who played the delicate game with the enemy. He was in a bullet-shaped formation and probed the enemy globe. Wherever he came, the bugger ships pulled back, as if to draw him in toward the ship in the center. Alay skimmed to the side. The bugger ships kept up with him, withdrawing wherever he was close, returning to the sphere pattern when he had passed. Feint, withdraw, skim the globe to another point, withdraw again, feint again, and then Ender said, Go on in, Alay. His bullet started in, while he said to Ender, You know they will just let me through, and surround me, and eat me alive. Just ignore that ship in the middle. Whatever you say, boss. Sure enough, the globe began to contract. Ender brought the reserves forward. The enemy ship concentrated on the side of the globe nearer the reserves. Attack them there, where they're most concentrated, Ender said. This defies 4,000 years of military history, said Alay, moving his fighter forward. We're supposed to attack where we outnumbered them. In this simulation, they obviously don't know what our weapons can do. It'll only work once, but let's make it spectacular. Fire at will. Alay did. The simulation responded beautifully. First 1 or 2, then a dozen, then most of the enemy ships exploded in dazzling light as the field leapt from ship to ship in the tight formation. Stay out of the way, Ender said. The ships on the far side of the globe formation were not affected by the chain reaction, but it was a simple matter to hunt them down and destroy them. Bean took care of stragglers that tried to escape toward his end of the space. The battle was over. It had been easier than most of their recent exercises. Mazer shrugged when Ender told him so. This is a simulation of a real invasion. There had to be one battle in which they didn't know what we could do. Now, your work begins. Try not to be too arrogant about the victory. I'll give you the real challenges soon enough. Ender practiced 10 hours a day with his squadron leaders, but not all at once. He gave them a few hours in the afternoon to rest. Simulated battles under Mazer's supervision came every 2 or 3 days, and as Mazer had promised, they were never so easy again. The enemy quickly abandoned its attempt to surround Ender, and never again grouped its forces closely enough to allow a chain reaction. There was something new every time, something harder. Sometimes Ender had only a single starship and 8 fighters. Once the enemy dodged through an asteroid belt, sometimes the enemy left stationary traps, large installations that blew up if Ender brought one of his squadrons too close, often crippling or destroying some of Ender's ships. You cannot absorb losses, Mazer shouted at him after one battle. When you get into a real battle, you won't have the luxury of an infinite supply of computer-generated fighters. You'll have what you've brought with you, and nothing more. Now get used to fighting without unnecessary waste. It wasn't unnecessary waste, Ender said. I can't win battles if I'm so terrified of losing a ship that I never take any risks. Mazer smiled. Excellent, Ender. You're beginning to learn. But in a real battle, you would have superior officers, and worst of all, civilians shouting things at you. Now if the enemy had been all bright, they would have caught you here and taken Tom's squadron. Together they went over the battle. In the next practice, Ender would show his leaders what Mazer had shown him, and they'd learn to cope with it the next time they saw it. They thought they had been ready before, that they had worked smoothly together as a team. Now, though, having fought together through real challenges, they all began to trust each other more than ever, and battles became exhilarating. They told Ender that the ones who weren't actually playing would come into the simulator rooms and watch. Ender imagined what it would be like to have his friends there with him, cheering or laughing or gasping with apprehension. Sometimes he thought it would be a great distraction, but other times he wished for it with all his heart. Even when he had spent his days lying out in the sun on a raft in a lake, he had not been so lonely. Mazer Rackham was his companion, was his teacher, but was not his friend. He had made no complaint, though. Mazer had told him there would be no pity, and his private unhappiness meant nothing to anyone. Most of the time, it meant nothing even to Ender. He kept his mind on the game, trying to learn from the battles, and not just the particular lessons of that battle, but what the buggers might have done if they had been more clever, and how Ender would react if they did it in the future. He lived with past battles and future battles both, waking and sleeping, and he drove his squadron leaders with an intensity that occasionally provoked rebelliousness. "You're too kind to us," said Alay one day. "Why don't you get annoyed with us for that being brilliant every moment of every practice? If you keep coddling us like this, we'll think you like us." Some of the others laughed into their microphones. Ender recognized the irony, of course, and answered with a long silence. When he finally spoke, he ignored Alay's comment. "Again," he said, "and this time without self-pity." They did it again, and did it right. But as their trust in Ender as a commander grew, their friendship, remembered from the battle school days, gradually disappeared. It was to each other that they became close. It was with each other that they exchanged confidences. Ender was their teacher and commander, as distant from them as Mazer was from him, and as demanding. They fought all the better for it, and Ender was not distracted from his work. At least, not while he was awake. As he drifted off to sleep each night, it was with thoughts of the simulator playing through his mind, but in the night he thought of the other things. Often he remembered the corpse of the giant decaying steadily. He did not remember it, though, in the pixels of the picture on his desk. Instead, it was real, the faint odor of death still lingering near it. Things were changed in his dreams. The little village that had grown up between the giant's ribs was composed of buggers now, and they saluted him gravely, like gladiators greeting Caesar before they died for his entertainment. He did not hate the buggers in his dream, and even though he knew that they had hidden their queen from him, he did not try to search for her. He always left the giant's body quickly, and when he got to the playground, the children were always there, woven and mocking. They wore faces that he knew, sometimes Peter and sometimes Bonzo, sometimes Stilson and Bernard. Just as often, though, the savage creatures were Alay and Shen, Dink and Petra. Sometimes one of them would be Valentine, and in his dreams he also shoved her under the water and waited for her to drown. She writhed in his hands, fought to come up, but at last was still. He dragged her out of the lake and onto the raft where she lay, with her face in the rictus of death. He screamed and wept over her, crying again and again. It was a game, a game. He was only playing. Then Mazer Rackham shook him awake. "You were calling out in your sleep," he said. "Sorry," Ender said. "Never mind, it's time for another battle." Steadily the pace increased. There were usually 2 battles a day now, and Ender held practices to a minimum. He would use this time while the others rested to pore over the replays of past games, trying to spot his own weaknesses, trying to guess what would happen next. Sometimes he was fully prepared for the enemy's innovations. Sometimes he was not. "I think you're cheating," Ender told Mazer one day. "Oh? You can observe me practice sessions. My practice sessions. You can see what I'm working on. You seem to be ready for everything I do." Most of what you see is computer simulations, Mazer said. The computer is programmed to respond to your innovations, only after you use them once in battle. Then the computer is cheating. You need to get more sleep, Ender.